Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Catch On's Catch the Experts webinar series. I'm Charmaine Chan, design editor at the South China Morning Post, and I'll be moderating the discussion today on the huge topic of future cities and how the pandemic has changed the way we view urban centers. Will cities survive in a post-COVID world? And if they do, how should they change to accommodate new realities? Density, our destiny. And should we fear it? We have a lot to get through. Our esteemed and opinionated panel of speakers from Shanghai, Singapore, London, and Hong Kong. They are among 20 architects, designers, and thinkers worldwide who contributed to a recent Catch On white paper on the topic of future cities. Aric Chen is an independent curator and professor. He's also director of the curatorial lab at Tongji University's College of Design and Innovation in Shanghai. Khee Poh Lam is at the National University of Singapore, where he is the Provost Chair Professor of Architecture and Building and the Dean of the School of Design and Environment. Victoria Whenray is a director at Conran and Partners in London. And Affleck is a director at Make Architects here in Hong Kong. Welcome, everybody. I've read your contributions to the paper, and you all offer really interesting but different suggestions about what we should be thinking about now as we envisage our future cities. So I'll jump around a bit at the start before we address the big picture questions, and we may have some audience questions thrown in. Thank you to those who've written in. Now, in the paper, there was one point on which everyone agreed, and that was the importance of green spaces. So are we going to return again to the idea of garden cities? Khee Poh, I thought I'd start with you. Should all cities aspire to be like Singapore, a city in a garden?
Yeah, well, there's a lot that can be learned and adapted from lessons of the growth and development in Singapore. But it has been a journey. I think it's important to recognize that when Singapore started and became independent in the mid-60s, 65, the then founding Prime Minister boldly proclaimed this vision of Singapore as a garden city. And it is a bold vision because at that time, if you look at the state of Singapore as a newly independent country, it is really difficult to imagine how it could turn out. But there was a bold vision called Garden City, perhaps influenced from the roots of the connection of Singapore and the Commonwealth and back to the UK kind of notion, right? Ebenezer Howard kind of idea of Garden City. So that's how it started. But as the journey progresses, around the sort of mid 2000s, 2007, 2008, there was another kind of visionary adaptation, and that became, instead of Garden City, the catchphrase then was City in the Garden. And that actually began to reposition the importance and the notion of garden as the main setting, rather than just having sort of curated or planted in between kind of spaces, but saying that the city should emerge and evolve out of the garden itself. Then most recently, the idea now is that we want to talk about city in nature, that we begin to expand beyond this notion of a manicured garden. Everything is neatly planted and grown, to really now embrace nature in all its diversity and indigenous offerings. Because that's something that has not been in the past been paid too much attention. We just want to make our garden look pretty. So I think that journey and that kind of development is really a very important lesson, in my opinion, or concept for study.
Thank you. Now, Victoria, in your contribution, I really like that you just come out and say, get cars off roads. Now, you're with the Academy of Urbanism and one of the lead assessors for the European City of the Year. can you tell us about a bicycle-friendly city where cars have been taken off roads and people are happy?
So, yes, I'd love to. So, yes, as part of my role as a city assessor, visited quite recently, last summer, Utrecht in the Netherlands. And I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of people around the world that look to cities such as the Netherlands and Denmark with some envy and appreciate that they're brilliant cycle-friendly cities. And Utrecht, by the way, has just recently been voted as the world's most bicycle-friendly city. And they look at these cities with some envy and think, but we can't do that. They've just always done that. And I think the important thing to mention here, a bit like Khee was saying, that it was a journey. So Utrecht, for example, it hasn't always been a bicycle-friendly city. In fact, it's a beautiful medieval city, and it had some amazing canals running through it. And in the 70s, the city leadership decided that they needed more cars in the city. So they actually created roads on top of the canals. And they had great highways just coursing through the city. So they're a city that really reflected upon some of their decision making and realised that it wasn't the healthiest city, and actually they were suffering some problems with pollution. And they redressed and they've rebalanced and they've decanalised their canals and reintegrated them as part of the city. And bicycles have now are their predominant form of transport. With that comes a healthier lifestyle. With that comes greater sociability. So actually cycling around Utrecht is a joy, because you'll just suddenly start having a conversation with somebody as you're cycling. Somebody that you just don't know, you'll just start talking about politics or something that's happening that day. And with that also comes improvements to businesses. So what they have discovered, that priority to pedestrians and cyclists create the environment where people are more likely to pause and dwell and stop and use their local traders. So it's a very holistic approach and reason as to reprioritising how cars sit within the city fabric. And
Is it very flat in Utrecht?
Yes, it is. And I appreciate that there are lots of different conditions to think about. But I think there's no reason why we can't think about how we view the car and reprioritise, no matter what the city is.
Thank you. Now, Sean, you wrote that while 2020 will be defined by COVID-19, 2019 should be remembered as the year that we woke up to climate change, and that the two should be linked. You then point out that the construction industry is one of the worst polluters and will need to reduce its carbon footprint. How should it do this?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, the construction industry, with its waste, its dust, its noise, its delivery, has got to grow up. It's got to develop, and they are doing it. I mean, they're looking into modularization, prefabrications. All these elements are built in a nice air-conditioned factory and then put on a truck and shipped out to the site. Is definitely the future. Having worked in Hong Kong, you go to a site and you see these poor guys struggling in the heat to try and build buildings, and you think, how is this possible? There's got to be a more sophisticated way of building buildings, and it's happening, and it's been forced because the aging workforce and quality and all those elements. But it's a fantastic way to reduce noise pollution. It will speed up construction. It'll be less impact on the neighborhood and people who live around the site. So it has to be the future. But what's really important, you've got to design that way at the beginning. You can't design a building and then say, oh, let's modularize it. You've got to become right at the beginning and think about how you're going to get these elements to the site, how they could be prefabricated, how they can be pre-built and pre-constructed and then brought to the site. It's seriously exciting, and it will transform construction, and it will transform buildings. So yeah, we definitely feel that's the future, and that's what's got to happen. It has to happen.
I guess it might make more people want to become builders, because we've got a growing population of builders, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, you go on the sites in Hong Kong, and they're all very old people. They really are. It's frightening. But yeah, you're right. We need to approach buildings like the way we approach cars and planes and other elements. And they are just as sophisticated. They need to be just as sophisticated. And that's the way we're going to approach it. But also spinning onto that is also that we've got to be really that building is now no more value. So, and I think one of the most exciting things is when you take an existing building and you reimagine it, because it makes you think in different ways, and you end up with interesting spaces, quirky spaces, different types of things that could happen. And that's just what makes things more interesting.
Thank you. Now, Aric, I kept you last for a reason. You don't think that the pandemic will change our city significantly, do you? In the way we design, build, or live. Why not?
Well, you know, maybe I should qualify that. I guess I don't think the pandemic will change our cities to the extent that some people are predicting it will. You know, it's been said a lot that the pandemic maybe has not changed the world so much as it has greatly accelerated many processes that were already underway, for better or worse. Now, on the better side, you know, I think the desire for more green space, the imperative to be more sustainable, the growing movement of pedestrianization that Victoria was talking about, you know, those are all there, and we can only hope that that some good comes out of this pandemic in accelerating those trends. You know, even with pedestrianization. You know, in Hong Kong, you know, Charmaine and Sean, I mean, you may know the Walk Devo Road Central initiative to pedestrianize Devo Road Central, which I was sort of helping out with a little bit when I used to live there. And they've been trying to do that for like 15 years. and maybe, you know, let's all hope that this is a good moment to try and push that through. New York has been, Manhattan has been pedestrianizing fairly significant arteries in the past 10 or so years, 10, 15 years as well. So we can only hope that continues.
When we talked, you said that after 9/11, there were many obits written for skyscrapers, and people were saying they weren't going to go back onto public transport, but none of that really stuck, did it?
Yeah, and of course we don't want to be too reductive in our analogies. I mean, you know, these are different situations, but yeah, I mean, I guess part of it is that, you know, part of my perspective is informed by the fact that I was living in New York on 9/11, actually in the West Village near the Hudson. So I had a direct view of the Trade Center with my own eyes as the second plane hit and the towers came. You know, I sort of lived with that famous smell of burning plastic that lingered for days afterwards. And I saw, you know, I read all the obits, as you say, for New York and skyscrapers and public transit. And of course, some things did change permanently. I mean, you know, especially downtown, you'll see more sort of you know, security barriers and so on and so forth. But you know, it was not the death of New York. And here's where I think we also need to, we need to also sort of acknowledge not only the fact with this pandemic that different places are experiencing the pandemic in different ways at different timescales, but also they're experiencing them through the lens of their own cultures, and cultures respond to these kinds of events differently. Going back to the kind of public transit and terrorism example, you know, after 9/11, people would said no one will ever take the subway again for fear of subway bombings. In London, which has had some pretty severe subway bombings in recent years, similar proclamations have been made. But in both cities, you might, well, in London, you'll see some more CCTV cameras, but that's throughout the city. But in both cities, you know, aside from more posters saying, if you see something, say something, and garbage cans replaced by plastic bags so you can see what's in them more easily, there's not that, there wasn't much of a change, right? Meanwhile, you know, I live in China, which to my knowledge has never had a major subway or any kind of real subway terrorist attack. And yet for the past 10 years or so, in all the major cities, you have to go through airport-like security just to enter any subway station. So,
well, thank you. I mean, that really has warmed us up for the big picture questions that I wanted to ask. Politico ran a story recently titled "The Death of the City." I mean, I think I know what you might say about this, Aric Chen, but Khee Poh, Sean, Victoria, what do you think? And while we're at it, what are the merits of cities?
I mean, we're social beings. I think we like companionship. So I think the cities will always be here with us because I think we enjoy it. And I've been talking to my London office has been shut down for the last 6 months or whatever. So I've been talking to everybody on Zoom and they are desperate to come back together again to see each other. People are worried, people are concerned, of course, but there is a feel of getting that sort of coming back together and joy and companionship and having that cup of coffee and meeting somebody in the corridor is that's how we operate. So I think cities are with us, but we can definitely make them better.
I agree. A city provides stimulation. It's a place of possibility, surprise. They're fantastic places. It's just actually working with the cities. And I think based on our early discussion, we're saying that actually life is going back to pretty much normal at the moment. But I think we have had an opportunity to dwell and to actually understand what we actually like about our cities and what we don't like about our cities, and maybe even created a wish list of things that we can change. And hopefully it'll push the door open with decision makers in terms of having those conversations with some greater authority and hopefully action as well in terms of making some of these changes.
I mean, you saw that in London, didn't we? Where they closed down the roads, suddenly become all people on their bikes and cycling away. Yeah. And they're going to keep quite a few of them closed, which is just fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. So they've just taken the opportunity. Absolutely. Yeah, seize the day.
That's right.
So, Khee Poh, do you see the demise of cities? Or is it premature?
I agree with Victoria and Sean. Cities will continue, because it is, as has been said, it's about the people, right? It's about a certain lifestyle in terms of work, living and play. Cities will continue as a organic sort of entity, the way I see it. It's not the bricks and concrete. Those are simply the enablers of all these activities that we are talking about. So moving forward, though, I think those expectation and change of behavior or not, and I think that we will see very divergent reactions to a post-pandemic sort of situation in different culture and different governance, for that matter. We will be able to see that. But in reaction to this, the changes in the transformation of the way cities are perceived needs to, in my opinion, begin to think much more flexibly and much more adaptive in terms of its spatial as well as time-based use. The old notion of very highly defined, right, zoning activities with a mono sort of culture or mono use, to me, those are going to be not sustainable. So we really need to think about this ability to adapt. And in Singapore, it grew out of a necessity because Singapore is just so small and it has to accommodate everything, right? And not just residential and hospitals and industry, etc. So therefore, they have to really be very, very strategic in trading off and making use of spaces as flexibly as possible. So that's a lesson as well, I think, in cities in the future, need to pay a lot more attention to. Having said that, though, tying back to, I think you were alluding to issues of density, which again is a question of population, all that is related. I think in my mind, there has to be some boundaries in terms of size. The way cities grow, in some instances where they continue to just keep expanding, for example, in China, in Beijing, right? Now they're talking about 6 ring road and 7 ring road and 8 ring road. And we see that all these ring roads did not really solve the issue of transportation and all the congestion, simply because you've got to deal with the kind of mass, right? So I think that there has to be some fundamental relook at what is a desirable and optimal size of cities that will make it governable, make it sociable, and make it livable, make it healthy, whilst maintaining a flourishing economy. I mentioned to you, Charmaine, the other day, you know, big doesn't mean good. Many of the big cities, if you compare their GDP per capita versus the kind of livability or happiness index, they don't do very well, right? So size is not necessarily correlated to all this perception of great living, great lifestyle, great economics. Is absolutely not correlated. So we need to seriously ask those kind of questions in each of the development.
Victoria, when we were talking before, you were mentioning the importance of the high street in fostering this sense of camaraderie and community. Can you just tell us what's been happening in your neck of the woods? You're in Brighton, right?
Yeah, sure. So I think Khee Poh was making a really good point about scale, and something that interests us at the moment is this idea of a walkable city or a walkable neighbourhood. And there's different phrases. There's healthy urban living. Paris are talking about the 15-minute city where everything is accessible within 15 minutes on foot. And I think actually that's a really good starting point. And what I observed being in lockdown and being in my own sort of neighbourhood, if you like, in Brighton, is that I was, without realising, living this with sort of 15-minute city, that everything was in 15 minutes. And what I really enjoyed was the high street, which is just 50 metres that way. It took on a really community-led entrepreneurial spirit. And this idea of flexibility, again, that's been mentioned, shops really had to change the way that they operated. So they basically created a counter at their door where you could queue up and they could go and get stuff for you. But also the local cafes, they started selling goods from their favourite suppliers just to help keep that chain going. And you know, there's things that I don't know what it was in other places, but for example, in the UK, there was a run on flour and eggs because everybody was baking. But the local cafes were selling flour and eggs because they had a good supply of them, and the local baker shop was actually giving out yeast and baking tips. So actually, it became quite a different place. And then going back to this idea of this phrase, rewilding the streets. There were no cars going up and down there, very few. So actually the high street became populated, and it became a real centre and a hub. And it was kind of one of these things you get a glimpse of what something could be like. And you just really wanted the local decision makers to seize the moment and almost just put bollards down at either end of the street and say, that's it, we'll just go with that. Let's just see what happens for the next year or two. They haven't. I have suggested it.
We should be there, actually.
Yeah.
Aric, before the pandemic sort of curbed your zipping around the world, you saw a lot of cities for your work. I mean, is there anything that struck you about them that you want to change, or even Shanghai? I mean, what needs to change for you to want to live there, work there, and play there?
Yeah, so I guess I'm like all the other speakers in that I'm an incurable cheerleader for the city as a concept, at least. Maybe not every city, but for the city, and I, you know, that's a really good question. And I think, you know, if there is a common thread, and this is more responding to what some of the other speakers were, or adding to what some of the other speakers were saying about what also needs to be addressed as we imagine the city post-pandemic, is also the idea of social equity as well. I mean, I think we're all aware that throughout the world, the wealth gap has been increasing at an unsustainable level, and the ways in which cities are designed, in fact, oftentimes reinforces that. right? Where the poor increasingly get squeezed out in favor of the rich and all the amenities that the rich that are there to serve the rich. Now, hopefully, if this pandemic is a good chance to rethink cities and sustainability and all that other stuff, the issues of social equity can also be placed in that. And perhaps it's already happening. I mean, who knows what will happen in the long term. I'm not so optimistic, but in some cities like New York, where the real estate market's crashing, a lot of people are saying, well, maybe some good will come out of this, and the city will be more affordable again. I think Hong Kong is probably having those same discussions. I'm not sure. Capitalism has an amazing ability to prove its resilience and to sort of reinforce existing dynamics. And I'm not sure that this pandemic will have much of an influence in that regard, in sort of leveling the field. But
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, in my introduction, I was talking about density and whether it's something we should embrace or fear. I wanted to explore whether there's a relationship between urban density and healthy cities. Khee Poh, I've heard you say that if a city is healthy, then its people are healthy. So how does a city become healthy?
Yeah, well, the important recognition that the city is a spatial, three-dimensional spatial entity. Although often we don't think like that, and certainly the economics of cities do not think like that. They think in dollars per square foot or dollars per square meter. And that's how cities are built and developed and designed and constructed. However, I think if you take it seriously, that cities need to really promote health and wellness, then you really need to look at the three-dimensionality of the space given in any given sort of locale. So the importance of obviously starting, I'm a really strong advocate of source control in all respect of our living. And therefore, if you want to look at promoting health, you've got to control the sources where those contributors of the sickness, if you like, need to be managed and not just mitigate, but really stop it wherever possible. And one of the important features that have now been very well accepted is this notion of outdoor ventilation, right? Make sure our cities are well ventilated, not just our buildings, but our cities are well ventilated. And I think that is now being really very strongly embraced. And that will make a tremendous impact on the way development of the future will progress. So that's very important. And once our outdoor is well managed and clean and air is flowing and so on, then we can talk about the indoor of our buildings. Yeah, as much as we want to promote this healthy indoor environment, lots of good natural ventilation. I always say, don't forget, if your outside air is bad, people will not open their window, right? They will shut it and put on the aircon. Not that it's any better necessarily. However, this is how human beings will react. And therefore, if you get the outside right, then the opportunities for creating healthy indoor environment will naturally follow. Not just in terms of health, but also in terms of comfort, to be able to capitalize on that. So connecting the outdoor and the indoor in controlling all aspects of source that will create the problem in the first place, I think warrants a lot of attention.
So you're saying we can't just look at things in 2 dimensions. It has to be volumetric. Sorry, Sean.
I was just going to jump in. You're absolutely right, Khee Poh, because when I first came to Hong Kong, I bought like an air quality device, and I opened all my windows in my apartment, and the air quality was shocking. I shut all the windows, and the air quality wasn't any better. It's like, you're absolutely right. We have to tackle pollution, air pollution, right at the root.
May I ask where you were living?
Just down the road.
Okay. I wanted to go to you, Aric. In your paper, you wrote that governments are using COVID to curb our civil liberties with surveillance, for instance, which brings me to smart cities. I mean, are they the way forward in a post-COVID world? Are we sacrificing our privacy for the sake of convenience?
Yeah, so just to reiterate this notion that COVID is accelerating things for better or worse, I mentioned some of the better earlier, now perhaps some of the worse. I mean, the prevalent, I mean, as we all know, the prevalence of surveillance is sort of growing and intruding on all aspects of our life. Now, there are, of course, smart cities does bring its benefits. It makes life more convenient. It sort of improves traffic and garbage collection and all these things that that technocrats and many of us dream of. But I think what we have to always keep in mind, and I was just talking about this to a class an hour ago, is that when we talk about the future, right, in many ways, the future does not exist in the way we used to think about it. The future is not what it used to be, let's say, in the sense that the things we talk about when we talk about the future, autonomous vehicles, Internet of Things, AI, machine learning, all that stuff, all of that was imagined, 50, 100, even more than 100 years ago. So these are not new ideas. These are not new propositions. What's new is that we are actually talking about enacting them in real life nowadays and dealing with the real world implications of those and of those enactments and having to sort of navigate that. And so it's not so much for me, it's not so much the technologies that we need to, really think about. Those will happen. It's more the sort of ethics and value systems and the wisdom to use those technologies that need to be the focus in good ways that need to be the focus.
I'd like to go back to surveillance. It's something that worries me. I mean, contact tracing has worked in several places, including Singapore. I'm not sure about London. So it's been successful, but at what price? Victoria?
You're coming to me first, but it hasn't worked. So I mean, I think Aric made a good point that there are some excellent technologies out of there. They don't always work, however, as we're seeing, and some new technologies are also being announced by the government that's being mocked, shall we say, even yesterday. So, but I think it does come down when the technology does work. People's liberties and the wisdom in using those technologies, and there's always going to be an upside and there's always going to be a downside. And I think it's how we manage the downside and how we can regulate against that. And actually, if we can do we somehow just accept that as a cost? I think that's probably a question, that's a personal question in some ways.
Khee Poh, in Singapore, it worked very well the first time around, contact tracing I'm talking about. Any thoughts about whether it was worth it?
Well, I think the statistics speak for itself. Again, it comes back to this very fact that Singapore, I always use this, it's a very unique situation. Singapore is such a small place. If something goes wrong, it can wipe out the entire nation. It's so tiny. So the risk, right? When you have a larger country, you have cities, different cities, East Coast, West Coast, and so on, you may not feel that urgency. But when you are in a city state, a nation, this vulnerability, people don't really fully grasp. And I think this is something that the importance of making sure the tight oversight to contain the situation is really, really necessary. So this is a first point I want to emphasize when seen in the context of a global, in comparison with other cities. And this whole technology continues to evolve. Just a week ago, they roll out new software. Now there's this dongle that you can wear. And in order to constantly make the technology more foolproof, quote unquote. So that continues. The effectiveness is there. I think it happens in two areas. One is the fact that people now are conscious about, you know, the importance of behaving responsibly for the sake, not just yourself, but your own family and your loved ones and your friends and so on. I think that sort of signal is clearly having an impact on behavior. So number one. Number two is the ability to very quickly contain and not be concerned about, you know, the kind of media interpretation of numbers. This often gets so kind of blown out of proportion. At one point, when Singapore, you know, experienced this huge surge of the dormitories and the workers, oh, Singapore is really now collapsing and the whole thing is going crazy. But the fact of the matter is, because that action was taken, appropriate reaction and action in terms of treating, you know, the patients and isolating them and making sure that they are given the due care, turn out to be exceptionally well managed. So that the ultimate result is not to stress the healthcare sector, because, you know, Singapore is small. Again, we don't have that many beds, that many hospitals to cater for this, you know, surge. Therefore, this very, very stringent, proactive testing, checking, and continuous monitoring actually pay off. And ultimately, you know, the fatality rate, as you know, is 27 in the entire country. And I think the last number, we had maybe 100 or so people still in hospital. Out of that, 58,000 numbers that are being, you know, advertised, as you will.
Thank you. I wanted to slip in a question from the audience. It came in overnight, actually, but I wanted to include it because just this morning I saw an Economist story entitled, "Is the Office Finished?" So the question that came in from a member of the audience was, will the work from home trend revitalize local neighborhoods and kill city centers? Who wants to take this? Sean Mahey?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that I think people do enjoy working at home, and I think but also I think people enjoy working together. So I think there'll be an increase of people maybe taking one day a week off at home, working at home rather than the office. But I still think people will want to come together. They want to join together in a collaborative approach or a social or whatever to create that sort of that unit. But I think it means that then if everybody takes one day working at home, suddenly your office space could shrink by 20%. So all these office space, which maybe we're running out of, maybe we're not, could open up for something else as another use. So I think it will mean that people will work in different ways. People will work in different places, from Starbucks to home to wherever. But I always think the office is like a club. You all come together, you join, you discuss, you reinvigorate each other, and it's all these off-cuff comments or side chats, which is very hard to do through Zoom, but all that which naturally happens when you just in the one space is people won't want to lose.
So this will change our cities, won't it? I mean, if people don't see the office as the second home, it's just somewhere you go when you need to interact with others. Victoria, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I agree with everything that Sean said. Just to add to that, I think there's the opportunity then for the workplace to become less of a workplace, but perhaps more of a creative place and a hub, and where people come and commune together as work colleagues. And actually, home is perhaps where you get your head down and do some of your production work. So this idea of sharing time between home and the office, I think does make sense. That's something, you know, that I know a lot of people, including ourselves, are looking at. Going back to another part of the question was, you know, are we seeing more activity on the high street and perhaps a hollowing out of the city? I think certainly that has been happening. Something that I've definitely observed, and even just talking to the traders on my high street, you know, I've been asking them, how's it been going? My local butcher recorded his profits have gone up quite significantly through lockdown, because he was actually capturing a greater market. So people were shopping in an old school sense, in terms of that they were maybe going out every couple of days to go and get their essentials. And again, that was creating that greater activity on the high street and conviviality, what have you. I am concerned about what's happening in, for example, the central cities, particularly London at the moment. And I think that goes back to an earlier point about we need to be more flexible to ensure resilience. So I think that's something for people and government to look at, in terms of how we can assist that flexibility so we can be more agile.
I mean, historically, cities have emptied during pandemics, but then they've bounced back.
Yes. Yeah.
Aric, what do you reckon will happen to Shanghai? Actually, you've told us it's bounced back, hasn't it?
You know, I feel a little bit. To be honest, Shanghai has been very lucky so far, knock on wood. I mean, we're all aware that things can take a turn for the worse at any moment, but Shanghai has been spared so far a lot of the more extreme effects of this pandemic. I mean, it's a city of 25 million people, and I think there have only been 700 confirmed cases, and I think maybe 10 or 12 deaths in total, and most of those were early on. So when I mentioned that different places are experiencing the pandemic in different ways, and so they'll react differently, I think this is a good case in point, because at the moment, and again, we know this pandemic is not over, and I think people are still being somewhat vigilant, but at the moment, it's Shanghai has, in my eyes, shows very little sign of being anything but business as usual. Again, for better or worse.
What's the situation in Singapore, Khee Poh?
Still cautious. Yeah, still cautious. But obviously the economic pressure is coming to bear, right? Having been kind of locked down for several months and affecting the economy, there is no doubt the pressure to reopen in order to keep the economy to bounce back, but cautiously done. Just recently, this week, they announced that the trade and exhibition and those kind of could now expand from a gathering of, I think it used to be 25 people or 50 people. Now you can do it 250, for example. So the classes in university, we used to limit ourselves to about, sort of 10 or 20. Now you can go up to 50, for example. So there is this very gradual expansion of the numbers, as it were, without sacrificing or relaxing on those procedures. Those procedures remain.
I was thinking about the implications of people working from home, offices closing, buildings having to morph into something else. In Hong Kong, who has the space to work from home permanently? Sean, I mean,
you're absolutely right. I mean, the apartments are tiny. You're absolutely right. It's I mean, in some respects, the offices are never closed in Hong Kong, and that probably is one of the reasons, is because the space is so tight and limited. But I think that's why I think people will enjoy the more public spaces. In fact, there's a lot of spaces around in cities. We say like cities full and complete. It's not. There's a lot of empty spaces. And I think that's one of the exciting things about Hong Kong, is lots of spaces and nooks and crannies are reused. Suddenly they turn into something different. I mean, I love the fact that when all the gyms shut, all the rooftops, especially in the low rise, were taken over as outdoor gyms. Or down the streets, you saw the parks first thing in the morning as the trainers had their classes out in the open. So I think you're right, but I think there are spaces within cities that could change, that can adapt, that can fill in all these gaps that people haven't really thought about so far.
Now, you have talked about how people in Hong Kong, for instance, will need to share more as their apartments become smaller and smaller. But with what we know about the pandemic, are people going to want to share co-working, co-living, renting things that you need? You know, what's going to happen to all of that?
No, I agree. I mean, we've been lots of conversations with hoteliers, and in some respects, the old model of a hotel was the cleaning, the staff behind the scenes were invisible. Now it's got to be in front of you. They've got to see. It's like a piece of theatre now. It's like going to a restaurant and you see the chef cooking in the back. That's what they want. They want to see the cleaners. They want to see people cleaning, dusting, cleaning the escalators or scrubbing down the escalator, the lift buttons. And I think that's really nice because that's what makes a city work, is all this invisible. But maybe the exciting thing is this won't be invisible anymore, and you will see it happening and you interact and you appreciate it more. So I think that is an interesting way it could change.
What about Victoria, the sharing economy? I'd just like to explore that a little bit further. What do you think will happen? Will people go back to wanting to co-work, co-live?
I think that's a really interesting question. My feeling is yes, people will go back to that. There's a reason why people enjoyed that as an opportunity and a premise. The co-working, for example, it's a great way for people who work by themselves. One of the great things about the co-working was actually people that were used to working at home that didn't want to work at home actually wanted to be in an environment where they felt part of a community. So I think as we've all talked, as people will want to go back to the office, I think people will want to go back to that co-working network as well. And I think just taking some different approaches about how that might be activated, as Sean was saying, you know, more public cleaning activities and people being more careful. I think also this idea of people living in the small apartments, I know I'm kind of going off tangent a little bit, and this idea that people they can't stay at home, they have to be able to go somewhere. And these moments that we're talking about, there's opportunities, almost some guerrilla activities where people can start reclaiming corners or bits of parking spaces that can become some seating areas with some, you know, pot plants, and people take ownership, and it becomes some interstitial space that people just kind of create. I think there's a lovely kind of story or opportunity there as well. So we're creating outdoor living spaces and outdoor working spaces. Then that goes back to the smart city, whereas if everything's got great Wi-Fi hookup, then why can't we just sort of spread ourselves throughout the city? So I'm going off tangent there a little bit, just picking up on a few points. So I do think we'll end up coming back together, but I'd like to think in different ways and more creative ways as well.
I'd like to just ask about your own cities. I mean, we've read about cities that have been repurposed for, you know, post-pandemic situations. Which temporary measures in your cities would you like to see made permanent? Any?
Well, I'll go. I mean, I've been banging on about it, so I might as well just continue banging on about it. There's a 2-kilometre strip of tarmac of road that runs very close to my house. Runs along the beach. Ordinarily, it's parking for tourist buses, parking for cars, and it becomes a bit of a kind of a racing track at night for, you know, some motorbikes and what have you. And it's not really. I don't think very well used. And one of the brilliant things that our council did was they blocked it off at both ends. So they didn't allow any traffic on it at all. And it's become the most amazing promenade that sits along the beachfront. And I really want them to stay that, to keep that. And they're coming under enormous pressure from residents to make it a car park again. And I also know it's a great source of revenue as well for the city. It creates an enormous amount of money from parking revenue. I just hope that they'll think beyond the immediate and understand the amazing opportunity that it could be in terms of really active promenade in a traditional sense that could then create its own economy. So that's the one thing that I really hope would happen.
I totally agree. I mean, it would be fantastic if in Hong Kong they could close down some of the roads, dig up the tarmac, grow some trees, spill out the cafes, and
Yeah,
you get these.
exactly.
I saw this brilliant electric scooter go up a 1 in 5 slope on an electric scooter, and he had fans on that kept him cool, and he just zoomed up this slope. And so it's no longer a cycle. You got electric scooters, electric skateboards, booster boards, or whatever. That's how people can get around. And as you say, Victoria, it will just transform it.
Mm.
Anything like that happen in Singapore or Shanghai? If not,
Yeah, Aric, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have to say Shanghai has been moving in a better direction for a while now, and not just in terms of improvements in public transport, but also public space. You know, there's a lot of really wonderful parks and promenades being developed along the former industrial waterfront of the Huangpu River. But I was thinking about your question, Charmaine, about what would we like to stay, you know, and for me, I think the answer, and this maybe goes back to this notion that we briefly touched on in terms of returning to the local, is that this pandemic and you know, bringing travel to a halt and so many other things to a halt has really made a lot of us who were quote unquote stuck here really sort of appreciate you know, where we live a lot more, and instead of sort of jetting around here and there, we're actually exploring our own cities and really engaging more in our own in the communities in which we live. And I hope both on a personal level and on a broader level that stays.
Yeah, in Singapore, I think, again, you know, historically in the conceptualization of the city-state, this whole hierarchical planning method that have been deployed by distributing the towns, and within the town, you begin to hierarchically look at the spaces from, you know, the town center to the precinct to the neighborhoods. That hierarchical structure still works extremely well. And I think the pandemic situation actually tested that as well. As earlier been mentioned, that people can walk and get their daily essentials without having to go down to the so-called city. And so they can still adapt and live reasonably comfortably. So I think that underlying concept is still valid. The challenge in the future, though, again, you started off, Charmaine, talking about, you know, now, of course, we're all focused on the pandemic. Matter of time, it will pass, but the imminent challenge of climate change and resilience, that will continue. And so in Singapore, there's going to be a lot more pressure to build infrastructure, like in the coastal kind of situation, right, to prevent the flooding due to sea level rise. For example, all these are really, really imminent challenges for decades to come. So now the pressure of building this concrete or whatever infrastructure to do that, the discussion now is that how can we even utilize that in a flexible way so that they do not just remain as a engineering or technical, you know, functional piece of utility, but how can we incorporate living and recreation and, you know, social enjoyment and gathering, so that, again, making opportunities available for flexible use. So those are discussions being undertaken as we speak.
thank you. I'm determined to sneak this in. I know some of you are bookworms. On the subject of future cities, could you just nominate one life-changing book that has perhaps shaped your way of thinking about future cities, about our cities? I won't point, but anyone?
I mean, when you mentioned this to me, I thought, and one of the earliest books I bought when I was a student was A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. And that was all about the idea of a city through all the way down to a doorknob. And the most compelling part of that was the fact that all our cities aren't designed by designers, they're designed by people who live there. And that's something that's really stuck with me, because, and that's why we all enjoy going to cities. We all like looking and enjoying it, because it's spontaneous, it's grown, it's organic, it's exciting, and it changes. So yeah, that'd be my book.
Thank you, thank you. I'm getting the waving hand, which means we're running out of time, but I thought we could perhaps draw the conversation to a close with some final thoughts, and I thought it might be a fun way just to think about where we will be in 20 years. We've all gone through various lockdowns. Will you be living in a city in 20 years? Yes, no, why?
Yes. Yes. I thought we had to do around.
Okay,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Sean?
I certainly
Oh,
intend to.
absolutely. Yes, I'll be living in the
Yeah.
city, but maybe I'll have access to an electric power boat that can take me out in the South China Sea at the weekends.
So living in a city but escaping the city at the same time.
That's right.
Again, you know, it is really about choice, right? The ability to have some choice. But as a predominant sort of locale, I've been a city boy, a city man, city old man my entire life. So yes, absolutely, we'll continue that because there are really a lot of benefits and opportunities. But as we all grow and get age, our needs will vary, and therefore we'll be looking for those different types of, you know, offerings that cities must get, which tie back to the whole health and wellness and prolonging quality of life, especially when we're old. We don't want to have long life, but the last 10 years we are spending in and out of hospital. That's not good. So we need to do a lot of proactive and preemptive work in our cities to make sure that the life course, and this is a word I learned from our public health people, the life course is well, you know, structured and well maintained.
Thank you. Aric, where are you going to be?
So my prediction is I will be living in a city, and so will most of humanity. So let's make sure we do it well.
Thank you.
Well said.
Last words, Victoria?
No, I just say, well said, Aric. Let's do it well.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists for their time and insights. And then the next day or so, this video will be posted on Catch-On's website with key takeaways. And if you haven't already, please download a copy of the Future Cities white paper. Thank you, and have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charmaine, for sharing. And thanks. Pleased to meet all of you.
Yeah, it was really good fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that. It was really nice to meet you all. Have a good Friday.
Thank you very much. You too.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.